Our next briefing will focus on wildlife corridors. Yes, it's a very exciting topic. Professor Cook and Professor Jocelyn look very enthusiastic today. And so if our briefer is ready, Emily, why don't we begin?
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Sankum and I'd like to welcome you all to the final briefing for the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act. I'd like to first thank my advisor, Dr. Cook, as well as the rest of my team for their efforts throughout the semester. And before we actually begin the presentation, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement to recognize that we are on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Lenape people, and we honor and pay respect to all Indigenous peoples by recognizing their relationship with this land. So today we'll go over 6 different topics. The first is background, then we'll go over problems addressed and solutions proposed by the bill, how the bill implements the solutions, and scientific controversies and metrics. Then we'll conclude with some key takeaways. So first, some background. So the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act was first introduced in August of 2021 by Senator Lujan and Representative Gallego in order to create wildlife corridors, which are just areas of land that connect habitats within tribal lands. And so this is an effort from the federal government to shift to a legislative framework that is focused on self-sovereignty and trying to give power and funding back to tribal nations so that they can govern themselves and make land use decisions. So next we'll go into some problems that are addressed by this bill. So this act addresses important problems concerning the environment. The first issue is the environmental problems created for wildlife. So habitat fragmentation is just parts of a habitat become destroyed and then they leave behind smaller unconnected areas, which then causes isolation and lack of resources. Then climate change exacerbates this because species have to migrate in order to find more suitable habitat, but they can't do that if the habitats are unsafe to cross or if they're fragmented. And so this negatively impacts their ability to move to access food and water, mates, suitable habitats, which thus impacts their ability to survive, grow, and reproduce. This results in a loss of genetic diversity and a decrease in biodiversity. The social problem of tribal land management and funding is the second issue addressed by this act. So tribal lands are complex in that there's a variety of landowners. So there's non-native owners of land, native owners, and then there's federal lands. And so this can make it very difficult to coordinate in order to actually implement tribal wildlife corridors. And so this is coupled with U.S. Government underfunding tribal programs and thus leads to limitations to land management. So next we'll discuss what solutions are actually proposed by the bill to address these issues. So the solution to isolated wildlife populations is the implementation of wildlife corridors. So as I mentioned before, these are just areas of degraded, often fragmented habitat, and they're restored to enable isolated wildlife populations to once again migrate and breed. So the habitat degradation usually occurs from human activities, such as like roads, cultivated land, or maybe natural resource extraction. And so by increasing connectivity, we increase migration and breeding, which thus increases biodiversity. And so there's 2 types of connectivity, which is structural and functional. Structural connectivity just measures the physical arrangement of a habitat, and functional considers how well genes move through a habitat. Together, the both of them improve wildlife migration, thus improving area habitability and the transfer of genes between populations. One great example of a wildlife corridor is the Yellowstone to YUKON initiative. We can see in 1993, just before it's starting, the green areas are protected areas, and the yellow are conservation areas, which is much smaller, and conservation areas might include corridors as well. And we can see 2013, 20 years after the start of the initiative, there are a lot more, about 50% more yellow areas. And so this indicates that by identifying areas that would be great for corridors and coordinating with private landowners, we can actually increase natural and genetically diverse species reproduction, as well as expand the range for species. But how do we know that actually occurs? So let's look at a case within Yellowstone to Yukon. So if we look at grizzly bears specifically, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the smaller brown line within that map is the 1980s range of grizzly bears. We can see that in 2016, the black line is the range of grizzly bears, which has increased over 100% for the range. The population has also increased from 400 to 1,700. And so this suggests larger ranges are generally good news for species. And so another important question to ask is why wildlife corridors are needed on tribal land specifically. So we see here, this is just displaying GAP Status 1 and GAP Status 2, which are just government designations for land managed for biodiversity. And so when we add in Native American reservations, we can see that many of these areas are closely associated with the protected areas. And so by adding them in, we can expand the range for many species. So our team made this map with data from the North American Environmental Atlas. And so we specifically chose these species, the black bear, black-tailed prairie dog, and spotted owl, because they're all migratory, endemic, and transboundary. That essentially just means that they cross the United States, Mexico, Canada, as well as tribal lands. And so when we look at these species, we can see that native reservations are a significant part of the land for them. And this is actually true for 30 of the 33 priority species recognized by the U.S. Geological Survey. And so this tells us that tribal lands are crucial for protecting migratory pathways as well as species ranges. So it's beneficial to create corridors here to increase connectivity to protected lands and therefore increase protected lands' ability to protect biodiversity. The second solution is to provide land management in order to address land management assistance in order to address tribal land management. This comes in the form of technical assistance, funding, and coordination. So more specifically, to understand why assistance is needed, we can see here a map of the Rosebud Reservation, which kind of resembles a checkerboard. So we can see that red and yellow are lands held by natives, and then white is privately owned land, and orange is federal reserve land. And so obviously, it would be a bit difficult to coordinate with them because there's so many different types of landowners, and it can cost a lot of time and money, as well as a bunch of other factors. And so the technical assistance provided by this legislation would provide the tribes with the means to actually implement wildlife corridors on tribal lands. And so to kind of explain what the mechanisms of this are, technical assistance is just improving access to wildlife data for tribes, as well as working with voluntary private landowners. And then funding is where the bill authorizes up to $50 million annually for tribes to actually receive grants and manage wildlife corridors. And then coordination is just allowing them to work with U.S. government agencies and tribes and other stakeholders involved in the process. So next, we'll discuss how the bill actually implements these solutions. So the bill has a procedure that requires the U.S. and government and tribes to actually work together. So first, the tribe nominates a wildlife corridor, and then the Secretary of Interior has 90 days to make a decision as to whether it meets the criteria. If it does, then they can provide grants and technical assistance to the tribes, and this therefore expands corridors as well as coordination with governments, tribes, and other stakeholders involved in the process. There are some controversies and that we will discuss, as well as ways to measure whether this program would actually succeed. So some controversies are increased predation, invasive species, spread of fire, and potential for disease, because they can move along corridors from one habitat and be introduced into another. However, a lot of these studies have been done in more closed settings, so they might not be more applicable to corridors, and so more research is needed in order to better understand their impacts and manage the corridors. So there are two types of indicators we can use to actually see whether or not these wildlife corridors are successful. So first are the scientific indicators, and we can use the number of species utilizing the corridor, as well as the number of individuals of umbrella species, which are just species where, when protected, they lend themselves to the protection of other species. We can also look at the transfer of genes within populations, as well as the acres of land protected in the U.S. We also might want to look at social indicators, such as the number of corridors nominated by tribes, which is probably the most important indicator because we want to know if the tribes are actually wanting to implement the corridors. Some other indicators might be community engagement and government collaboration, which is just trying to see if the community is getting involved with the management process and putting in their ideas, as well as if the government of the U.S. and the tribes are working together. Overall, it seems pretty apparent that the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act would be very beneficial to both wildlife, tribes, and so habitat fragmentation and climate change are causing biodiversity loss, and so wildlife corridors can increase connectivity and reduce the impacts of fragmentation. And so the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act provides a mechanism for tribes to implement corridors. Thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. I just had a question about, since you are working with tribal lands and tribal nations, does the bill discuss or designate any collaboration with the tribal people about like traditional knowledge that they might want to apply to, I don't know, a specific species or something along those lines about promoting biodiversity?
Yeah, so when this bill was first introduced, it was actually brought up to, I think, Senator Lujan. I forget which person it was exactly. But it was actually from the tribes themselves coming up to them and saying, hey, we want to be able to implement such an act. And a lot of the tribes actually, it's not like creating a corridor. Many of them want to be able to have these wildlife corridors, but they don't have the funds to do so. So obviously many of them have traditional knowledge that they'd like to apply to manage their land. And so this bill isn't necessarily like the US government like managing it like as a co-op. It's more of them providing assistance for them to be able to do so. So the tribes more so have the, I don't know what the exact word is, but they're the ones kind of like, figuring out what kind of knowledge to use with the lands. I'm not sure exactly of what kind of knowledge that is, but from my experience, what I've learned about it is that they have very specific ways of thinking about nature and their relationships with them. So I would assume they would apply that here.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a quick question. Can you explain a bit more how climate change can affect migration and biodiversity loss, and how the bill is going to tackle those issues?
Yeah, I do have a slide on that actually. So climate change is causing increases in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, increases in droughts and waves, and stronger hurricanes. So there could be a lot more natural disasters or just other things that might make the habitats for species less suitable. And so these changes are impacting ecosystems and forcing them to move. And so habitat degradation and climate change would impact migration and result in biodiversity loss. And so when we look at the common loon, we can see a shifting range of where they generally reside. The red used to be suitable habitat, but it's now unsuitable, so they have to move more into the blue section where you can see that 18% of the range has been gained, and in the red, 27% of the range has been lost.
Thanks for the presentation. This may not be strictly in scope of what you researched, but I'm curious to hear if you came across any international agreements or arrangements for inter-country wildlife corridors, since you mentioned that species often like cross across boundaries. So I'm just curious to see if you came across any successful arrangements in that regard.
I don't believe that this is something we specifically researched, since this is more of a national bill, but I do believe that there's legislation that, like, for instance, from my personal knowledge, this is kind of like a bit different, but I know of like the International Whaling Commission is specifically for whales, well, obviously it's for whales, but obviously, the other countries would have to work together in order to kind of understand how they can really, what is the word? Rule, I guess, for lack of a better word, how to kind of manage these wildlife. And so I imagine there's plenty of those in place for other wildlife as well.
Thank you.
We've been talking a lot about invasive species and pathogens. Does this bill address on how it might try to stop invasive species from spreading through the U.S.?
Just in invasive species in general?
I would assume that the land corridors would also help invasive species move around more easily. So I was wondering if there are any safeguards in place.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this is one of the considerations that is something people have considered as to whether or not invasive species would be able to move more easily through the wildlife corridors. But I think from what I've read, wildlife corridor designers have to take that more into consideration because they have to actually figure out how are the, I guess, for instance, like plants, are they going to flow through the habitats, or maybe they just need to examine it more in an actual corridor setting as opposed to labs so that they can see whether this actually has an impact, because it hasn't been as well studied from what we've seen. Thank you.